32 ticks following, so they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow two will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn?
Thank you very much. You're welcome to the 2020 version of the Arcade Book and Arts Festival. This is a book discussion centered on the subject of a book called Hubris, A Brief Political History of the Nigerian Army, written by Major General Akintunde Akinwunmi, retired. And we're actually at his home because in these COVID-sensitive times, travel to Nigeria was not an option. So I want to first of all thank the General for accommodating us here.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Well, we're going to go straight on to the book itself, which you can see here. I've got my own copy, very proudly so. I say without any form of equivocation that this is one of the finest books on the military history of Nigeria that I have read. You know, every book has its criticisms, its pros and cons, but it was definitely one of my favorite books. Whilst declaring an interest at the get-go, I will, however, say that our conversation shall be long, and it certainly shall involve some hard questions. And the over 30 years in the military in two continents, I certainly hope the General is able to face the hard challenges that I shall try and pose.
Well, you bring it on.
Thank you. As I say, fighting talk.
Yes.
Right. I'm going to start with... My first question is actually about you. Because we can't actually go into this book without talking about the author. First question being, tell us a bit about yourself, about your journey into a medical career, a military career. Where did it all start for you? But just tell us a bit about your history.
Yeah, sure. Well, it started in the labor ward of the University College Hospital in Ibadan, which is the medical school I eventually ended up training at, where both my parents worked. I was born there 5 years ago. And I grew up in Ibadan, so primary and secondary school in Ibadan. I had always wanted to be a soldier. It's the one thing I ever wanted to do. When I finished school, I was both too young and, looking at me now, it's difficult to believe, but I was also too small to join the army. But those things were trifling compared to my father's visceral opposition to any thought about his eldest son joining the army. And I think this derived from the fact that he had been born and brought up in the north, went to school with what is now known as the Langtang Mafia. So a lot of the officers of that era were his schoolmates, General Joshua Dogunyaro, Colonel Amadou Ali, late Colonel Ayuba Tense, to name a few. And he absolutely would not stand for any thought of my joining the army. So it was then, okay, well, what's plan B? I'd been born and brought up in a medical environment. So I kind of took the calculation that, after 5 years of medical school, I would certainly be old enough, with some luck also big enough, to join the army. As it transpired, both of those things happened. The unfortunate thing that happened in the middle was that my father, who was the greatest impediment to my joining the army, sadly passed away when I was a fourth-year medical student. So as soon as I'd qualified as a doctor in '86, did my house jobs, and the next thing was to go straight into the army. So I served with the Brigadier Guards of the Nigerian Army, first of all in a place called Elili near Port Harcourt, and then subsequently in Bonny Camp. I had wanted to convert to a regular commission, but sadly, in the days of a political army, that wasn't possible. My then brigade commander, late General Joshua Madaki, made it clear to me, although he would have been very happy to keep me. It had been made clear to him by the powers that be that, as he so eloquently put it, I had more chance of being struck by lightning and winning the lottery on the same day than having my commission converted to a regular commission. I think I'd taken the view, and I probably expressed it once too often in the mess, that the army could barely run itself, and it had no business trying to run a country. And I think clearly, in those days, the bad old days, as I call it, of a political army, that got back. And anyway, so at that point, having a medical degree to fall back on was very useful. So I left Nigeria in 1989 and came to the UK ostensibly to kind of do my postgraduate training. But of course, the lure of army life was far too great. So actually, before I even registered to do the postgraduate exams, I made inquiries about joining the Army Reserve, it used to be called the Territorial Army. And I did so. I was commissioned interestingly on the same day as the Orca coup happened, in which a couple of my colleagues, one of whom we shared a flat, were actually ended up being executed as a result of that coup. So, and it's been a roller coaster since then, really. And that came to an end on the 31st of March last year in 2019 when I retired as a chief medical officer. And I've been a bloody civilian since. But I've continued with medical practice. So I work part time as a doctor still. Oh, and the most important bit, and they'd kill me if I left this out. I have 4 daughters who bully me incessantly.
You've summed up an incredible career of over 3 decades in less than 2 minutes. Well done. I would probably still be starting.
Well, I made inquiries. I went to an army recruiting center, and they said, well, I actually said, look, my preference would be to join an infantry unit. Anyway, so I filled out all the forms. There was then the 5th Battalion of the Royal Anglian Regiment as one of the companies in Bedfordshire, not too far from where I lived at the time. So I rocked up, had an initial interview, and it happened they didn't have a regimental medical officer. So we came to some sort of negotiation, which was that I would commission into the Royal Army Medical Corps and serve on paper as their regimental medical officer, so therefore filling a gap that they had. But although commissioned in the Royal Army Medical Corps, I don't think I actually set foot in the medical unit for the next 14 or 15 years. So anyway, they sponsored me. And it was a fairly complicated process. I had to pass a unit interview, then was sent up to the brigade headquarters, which was then in York, to get the brigade commander's sign off, and then reported at Sandhurst for the commissioning course, where I came across any number of old and grizzled veterans of the British Army who immediately recognized that I was Nigerian, including one who still remembered the days of Gorn and Ajor at Sandhurst. It was from one of them I learned one of the most valuable lessons, on day one at Sandhurst. And he said 2 things you need to remember. The first thing is that whatever you do, don't offend the RSM. And second, always be good friends with the drummer who sets the pace of the march of the parade. I've never forgotten those 2 lessons. Sandhurst was really good. I really enjoyed that. And then my first posting was back to, obviously, the Royal Anglians. Over the next few years, I drifted into, I moved around a bit. So I worked, obviously, infantry, then logistics. Then I did a stint in what I call the Black World. I ended up at the Army Officer Selection Board, where we worked to select potential candidates to send to Sandhurst. Then I went to the Army Medical Services Training Center as a directing staff.
And you retired on what rank? Yeah. Yeah, I know, it's a question I need to ask.
Yes. I was Major General.
Okay. And that would be one of the most senior ranks ever held by a person of Nigerian origins. Would that not be?
I don't know any either. But I think that's really not the point. For me, the real point is that is two things, really. One is that in the entire time I spent in the British Army, I don't recall, other than 1, possibly 2 occasions, of coming across anything that remotely smacked of racism. And those were when I was much, much, much junior. But more importantly, actually, and I speak now from the defense rather than an army perspective, it's probably one of the most meritocratic institutions that I've ever come across.
I'm going to start with hubris. how did you come about? Why hubris? First of all, because I mean, obviously, the subtitle is a brief political history of the Nigerian army, but the word hubris is writ large on the cover, writ large in the consciousness of anyone who sees it. So it must have been writ large in your consciousness when you chose the title. So why the title hubris in the first place?
Well, I think the key really is in looking at the reasons why the army became involved in Nigeria's political scene in the first place. They became involved on the basis of coming to correct all the ills of a, quote, bloody civilian regime that had preceded it, which, to be fair, was not without its problems. But you then fast forward 30 years to when or 33 years or whatever it is, to when the army left the scene. And you think, okay, did they actually achieve what they set out to do? Or did they in fact make things worse? And my view, unequivocal view, is that they spectacularly made things worse. And I was just struck about that kind of overweening arrogance of a bunch of 20-something-year-old army officers presuming to know that to think that they had all the answers and could right all the wrongs and set it all back where they thought it could be, and then look at the Nigeria that they bequeathed to the current. I'm not going to call it a democracy. I'm going to call it a civilian government. And that Nigeria in 1999 was infinitely worse than it was in 1966,
okay.
And it's got worse since.
Okay. I'm going to start with the forewords. The forewords to this book. I mean, there's you got some pretty heavy hitters to input on this, and I guess that's testimony to your own credibility with the military establishment. But then I'm going to go into the first foreword by Lieutenant General Akinwunmi, who's a man who I have a great deal of respect for. And he raises a point of question. Says, I do not share entirely Akinkunmi's fear that the agreement could have left northern Nigeria with a navy. I mean, he's referring to the Constitutional Conference decisions in 1966. I do not think a landlocked nation has a need for a navy, nor the resultant regional armies could have been nothing more than glorified regional militias. Because what you suggested there was that the creation of regional military infrastructure, that your view, even though it was kind of like very fleetingly summarized, was that the North, or what use would have been a navy for the North. So his view here is that he did not agree with you that a landlocked nation did not need a navy. Do you have any comments on that before we proceed?
Well, I think with great respect to General Akinwunmi, who is somebody I have a really fierce admiration for. I think my boss there may have kind of slightly misunderstood the point I was trying to make.
Yeah.
My point was that the agreement that came out, the second order effects of the agreed agreements as fashioned by the civil servants who kind of met and to try to put some effect to these things, suggested in essence that all the services would be divided up amongst all the regions. And I was making the point, well, that, that's all very well, but what use does the Navy, did the Northern region have for a Navy? So there was an element of just kind of towing the line and thinking about these things on critically. I think that was part of the flaws of what the civil servants came up with. And I was just kind of making the point that, well, yes, it's all very well wanting to be equitable and distribute everything equally, even if that is the right thing to do, which I didn't think it was. But then it doesn't explain, it's all right, fine. So when you divide the Navy up, what are you going to do with the north part of it? Where are they going to run this Navy? That's the point I was trying to make. I think it got lost in translation. So.
Fair enough. Now I'm going to go to the next forward written by Avian A.D. Bello, who, one of the greats of the Nigerian Air Force. And, he makes a point here, and I'm just going to read the paragraph very quickly. While the author did his bit to interrogate the relationship between the Army's evolution and its relationship with political developments in Nigeria, and the kind of impact this association may have had separately and jointly on the spirit of the army and government in Nigeria, I believe it must always be stressed that scholarship of the subject must be undergirded by a sense of balance and fairness. For example, when General Gowan introduced the phenomenon of state creation in the days leading to the Civil War, it was a decision made following due consultation and consideration of its likely effect on the tense atmosphere in the country at the time, which eventually proved fortuitous. Therefore, to place the creation of states on that occasion and treat it in much less the same way as subsequent attempts at state creation did not take the principle of balance and fairness into account. Would you care to comment on this?
Well, I think actually Oga Abdul has a point there. The circumstances in which those first 12 states were created were completely different to the circumstances in which every subsequent state creation exercise occurred. So if the criticism is that perhaps I could have done a little bit more to kind of emphasize that it was slightly different, then I think it's a valid criticism. That said, I also do make the point in the book that that first state creation exercise is the only one that created exactly the same number of states in the north as in the south. Every subsequent one has made that balance has been lopsided. So at every stage, with every additional state creation exercise, there have been more states created in the north than there have been in the south. So in some ways, actually, I think that addresses part of the criticism, which is that, yes, it was done in different circumstances. It was done in a state of emergency, but it nonetheless managed to achieve a north-south balance. The other state creation exercises that were done in a slightly more relaxed atmosphere don't have that excuse.
All right. So in effect, you acknowledge what he says, but say, well, actually, you did make a distinction subsequently.
Indeed, yes.
Okay. I won't say that you're saying, well, look, the criticism was not fair because you'd already actually dealt with that. I won't say you didn't say so, but I would say so. Okay. Now, I'm going to go to the next point that the AVM makes. And so he says, while the army must carry the can for whatever gaps and failures it is alleged to have introduced into the Nigerian society, the purpose of scholarship is not helped if investigators avoid the almost corrupting roles of politicians who held nocturnal meetings with soldiers, sold all kinds of ideas to them, and then distanced themselves from these soldiers when the public chose to lionize them. Surely it would make for interesting reading to know the roles leading politicians played in the various military coups and subsequent governments that were formed in Nigeria. Any comments on that?
Well, I thought about that, and the reason I did not include them in this book was twofold. First of all, I didn't want it to kind of become a history of coup making. And I think going into this in any depth would have kind of run that risk. Secondly, I think that there are, a number of other books that have been written about the history of coups in Nigeria, notably the ones by Matt Seelman, which are, I think, actually cover those kind of things in a bit more depth. And third is that the book is about a political history of the Nigerian army. And so for those three reasons, I chose not to go into that in some depth. Okay. It was not an inadvertent omission, it was a deliberate omission.
Fair point. Okay, so we're going to go into the meat of the book. We've dealt with the preamble now. Just a bit of an introduction to Hubris, if you haven't got a copy. And I certainly recommend you do. It's got 16 chapters. It starts, we've dealt with the forewords and the introductions. Now, from chapter 1 deals with the beginning, runs through to chapter 16, through the overt entry into politics, the political background, the various military governments. It kind of does a traverse of events and indeed assesses them, to some extent. Although, I'm grateful that the author actually makes the point clear that, about where he has what has motivated his thinking, and he also makes distinctions between referencing, historical data and conclusions. The conclusions are opinions from his own perspective. He makes that very clear, so you can make a distinction as a reader. But I'm going to just, as we said in our conversation earlier, rather than asking you what the bibliographical motivations were for the book, I think what we'll do is, as we'll go through certain chapters,
sure,
please feel free to, tell us what motivated certain chapters, at least in bibliographical terms. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Now I start with the beginnings
Yes.
of the army, the origins of the army,
Yes.
and you state here that really your thesis here, clearly relying on quite some fairly strong references, which I agree with myself, is that the army was a collection of forces of expedience by John Glover, who, as you put it here, he put together a motley collection, your words, a motley collection of runaway slaves and other miscreants from what is now northern Nigeria. And essentially what you advance is that these were put together not as a force of defense of the territory, because clearly at that time, there was no entity known as Nigeria,
Yeah.
and they were put together by a foreign entity. And effectively what they did was to protect the interests of that foreign entity,
Correct.
not interested in. Could you give a bit of background as to why you hold the perspective, or should I say, what grounds this viewpoint?
Well, I think, if one looks at even what the army itself has written about its own history, its official history,
Yes.
the history of the army by the Nigerian Army Education Corps, they make the same point. Now, one of the difficulties that I think trying to write a historical account of this nature has to overcome is not to substitute the judgment of the author in the 21st century with what the conditions were on the ground at the time.
Yes.
So, in essence, these people, what eventually became the colonialists, they were trying to subjugate the local population and bend them to their will. That involved a use of coercive force. And so the object of what that force that eventually became the army was actually nothing about national protection or national defending the nation state and all of that. It was simply a tool of oppression, which I suspect was one of the major reasons why over subsequent years the army's reputation was actually pretty much at rock bottom with the populace, because they still saw them as these people, these, quote, traitors who had enabled a foreign power to subjugate them. And I think, there's plenty of historical evidence for that, both military and non-military. All you need to actually is kind of read some of the works about Lugard. Dame Marshall Perham has written some very good stuff on him. And it's very clear from all his papers that these troops were a means to an end. The end was the subjugation and therefore the control of the territory. End of. It was not to kind of, as subsequently was then posited, that, we were doing this to kind of civilize them and bring to them the benefits of Christianity and civilization and all that. So that's all nonsense. It was a coercive tool, full stop.
Would you say that the original seed of creation, tool of oppression, was now an ingrained cultural template in the DNA of the army? Would you think that this is a culture that now became an inheritance of subsequent evolutions of the army?
I don't know that I'd go that far on the simple basis of that old saying, soldier come, soldier go, barrack remain. The people who were involved in doing that were not the people who were kind of shooting politicians in their beds in 1966, and were not the people who were kind of assassinating heads of state in 1976. I think that's a slightly different narrative, a slightly different dynamic. I think the key to how the army went off the rails subsequently lies in the impunity that goes with absolute power. I think that's the kernel.
Okay, and I think that's something that we cover in a bit more detail later. So I just want to fleetingly cover, something else, it's General Richard Dannett, whom I have a great deal of regard for. I regard for his service. And he made a reference to in Boots on the Ground, which you very clearly referenced here, about the nature of recruitment based on the so-called warrior races. We saw that he referenced the Sikhs.
Yes.
The Sikhs in India, and obviously we talk about the Gurkhas in Nepal, and then we come to the Hausas.
Yes.
In that very nebulous term, the nebulous description of the Hausas of northern Nigeria. So clearly there was a preference for the Hausas as an ethnic a recruitment point for the Nigerian army in its nascent stage, and it also appears that for that very reason, for reasons of obviously communication and convenience, Hausa was the language of communication.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to take a quantum leap forward into the book.
Yeah.
That particular northern character of the army, would you say that, that transference, would you say there was a transference, an evolutionary transference of that nature, that ethnic imprint, stamp from the nascent stage on to the present day?
I think it applies to some parts of the army, not all parts of the army. This relates, in essence, to the fighting troops, the infantry.
Yes.
Pure and simple. And that pretty much carried on throughout the era of the interwar years, and then the Second World War, and then the era immediately leading up to independence and shortly thereafter. Because what you found was that, in essence, the fighting troops were consisting mainly of northerners. Originally, it was people from the what's called the far or the core, the dry north, so the Hausas and the Fulanis. Over time, that focus moved slightly south, and then it became the Domas and the Tivis of the Middle Belt.
Mm.
And they, by the time we got to around the area of kind of independence, were by far the biggest single group in the fighting arms of the army. Although the July coup that brought Gowon to power had been driven mainly by officers from the core north, there were also several of them who were not from the core north, who were the middle belt and actually Christian. So the three ringleaders of the July 66 coup, Muratala Muhammad was a Fulani from the core north, but the other two, Theophilus Danjuma and Martin Adamu, were both northern Christians from the middle belt.
Okay. Right, well, that's at least that provides a bit of context, which we'll delve deeper into that later. Now, we go into the army. Obviously, I'm going to leave you. I don't want to. We can't cover the book in so much detail. We have to leave something for you people to go and read. But I'm going to jump now to a part where you deal with conceptions. By the time a professional army, so to speak, had been created by the 1930s, 1940s, a particular perception of the army had been created. I mean, at the time before the Second World War, the army was still pretty much a frontier force, even though they had seen action in the East Africa and in the Cameroon during the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a professional army had been created with its own character and so on and so forth. I can tell you, as a scholar, that as far back as the 1890s, the army had a very bad reputation. Even in the Lagos Weekly Record refers to the actions of the regiments, with their vandalism in certain parts, where in the barracks, acts of pillaging and rape and so on and so forth. Now, so by the 1940s, the army had a particular character. And in fact, in Igbo land, there's a saying which I will translate, which is "Onye muru soja wara kanwa," which means he who bears a soldier for a child is childless.
Yeah.
So there was that perception. But then, and you refer here, I'll quote paragraph from your book, and I give you room to espouse on this. The general disdain for servicemen in Nigeria was long-standing and had no particular geographical focus. For example, as far back as the 19th century, the men of the Niger Coast Constabulary were referred to as the 40 Thieves. In 1962, Sodona of Sokoto described the origins of the military in Nigeria thus: when the British came to the north, they started recruiting their army of soldiers by getting slaves who ran away from their masters, laborers from the markets, and so on, and had them enlisted by force. We did not like the soldiers; they were our own people and had conquered us for strangers. And Tony Eze goes on to say, in 1963, the army was a place for the illiterates and criminals whose duties were to kill and be generally brutal. The activities of some soldiers in the villages and markets during the last war only confirmed their opinions. Would you shed some light on perceptions of the army, and from at least based on the research you did?
Well, I think that proverb that you just quoted says it all, really. I had actually heard it before, but in the English translation,
Okay.
not in the original Igbo.
Yes.
This was not something that was viewed as an honorable profession for people who were serious and who were of good birth.
Yes.
So it was a profession for rejects, for ne'er-do-wells, for people who perhaps ought to have been in jail, kind of thing. And that perception permeated the entire country. It's one of the, if you think about it, actually, we in these days we're searching for things that we unify us, that we all agree on. There is one right there.
Yes.
Didn't really matter which part of the country you asked the question; the answer was the same. And over time, more in some parts of the country than in others, people worked assiduously to change that perception. And I think the North was probably where they worked the hardest, because there was a very deliberate policy of encouraging Northern youth, and mostly men, to join the army. And when you begin to see the blue bloods, somebody like Hassan Katsina, whose father was the Emir of Katsina, joining the army, then you know the tide has changed. Because it was no longer seen as something for riffraffs. It was now something to be aspired to. And the Northern Region government then threw a lot of energy and effort into going and doing these recruitment efforts, led by the Sardauna himself, Tako Galadiman. They would go around these schools with the officers, the Northern officers who had already been commissioned, people like Yakubu, would go along with these people as part of a recruitment drive. The story is told about how 8 members of the class of 1962 at the government secondary school in Bida all joined the army on the same day. Now, when you think about who those people were, Ibrahim Babangida, Maman Batsa, Muhammad Sani Bello, Muhammad Gadru Nasco, need I say more? Abdul Salam Abubakar. Now, of that lot who joined the army on that day, 2 of them became head of state, Babangida and Abdul Salam. And all of them, Baba Sani Bello, became generals. That sort of concerted drive never happened in the East or in the West. And because, and I think this is a function of the prevalence of Western education in those kind of 2 southern regions, meant that the aspiration was to become doctor and lawyer and engineer and all this kind of stuff. And my personal view is that, at least at that time, the Northern political leaders demonstrated a much better grasp of strategic thinking than we did in the South.
So I'm just going to go into next. I mean, you take me to my next point. But things began to change.
Yes.
Because one, I mean, I'm just going to throw this out there, and then you can deal with it in any way you want. The thing is that there was a perception of the army being a place for ne'er-do-wells, and apart from that, you also in the book highlight the fact that there's a major disparity in remuneration between army officers, commissioned officers, and graduates, university graduates. At the time we were developing an identity, developing a middle class. There was a disparity in income, so nobody wanted to join the army. And obviously, you give a background to the fact that these things were controlled by one. The British, the UK Ministry of Defence actually controlled wages and salaries at one stage.
Mm-hmm.
But then the Nigerian government now took over, and then there was a change. Could you give a background as to how things changed and why?
Yes, indeed. I mean, the key thing was that this was an outcome of the 1957 Constitutional Conference, where it was decided that Nigeria would become independent in 1960. And as part of that process, on the 1st of April 1958, the control of the army passed from the British government to the Nigerian government. Now, prior to that, the Nigerian army, or the Nigerian regiment, as it was then known, was part of West Africa Command of the British Army. So it was funded 100% by the British taxpayer. The British made all the decisions in terms of recruitment, retention, policies, equipment, all that sort of thing. And the Nigerian government really had no say. In fact, I think I quoted some Nigerian legislator saying, in frustration, that the Nigerian regiment actually is Nigerian in name only. From the 1st of April, the Nigerian politicians now had control.
Yes.
The Nigerian taxpayer funded the army entirely. And the old saying, he who pays the piper dictates the tune. The one thing I would emphasize is that whilst the British were in control of the army, i.e. up until April 1958, although the army had been put on standby for internal security operations on a number of occasions, it had never once been deployed in that role. That changed significantly when the Nigerian government took over, because we now were able to make all the decisions in terms of recruiting, in terms of equipment, in terms of training, in terms of deployment, because now we footed the whole bill. And it was only a matter of time before the Nigerian government started to introduce that dreaded word, quotas. Now, I completely accept the premise that, there was a need to broaden the base of the army so that it looked more like the population it represented. Completely get that. But I think, like all things, you have the thin end of a wedge. So things started to happen. First of all, they introduced a quota system for the other ranks, not the officers at this stage, the other ranks. On the face of that, it actually seemed to disadvantage the North, because what it said was that 50% of the other ranks had to come from the North, 25% from the East, 25% from the West. There was no Midwest at the time. And at that point, actually, the other ranks probably constituted more than 50% the Northerners constituted more than 50% of the other ranks. So this quota actually seemed to reduce their numbers. In practice, what happened was that the other two regions, particularly the West, continuously had difficulty in filling its quota. So the bits that the West especially couldn't fill then defaulted to the North. The second was that they now introduced quotas for the officers. And they did that initially on the same path as the other ranks, 50 North, 25 West, 25 East. What they also did was that they then, and in a way they were now able to stipulate, because they control the whole thing, that quota would apply not just to the intake of potential cadets, it would also apply to the final pass list, irrespective of what the order of merit was. So in essence, 50% of the graduating class in any one year would have to be Northerners, irrespective of whether they made the cut or not. So if you think about it, it was possible for a Northerner to subsume a Southerner on the final pass list who had been above him in the list of merit, but it wasn't possible the other way around. Then they took it one step further. They started to drop the educational requirements. Under the British, it had been you needed 5 O-level credits. The first change the Nigerian government made was to drop that to 5 O-level passes. Then they went one step further and dropped it even further, so that you now, I think it was in 1961 or 62, somewhere around there, that they then dropped it so that you could now get in as a potential officer with a teacher's grade 2 certificate or Royal Society of Arts grade 3 certificate. Yeah. Look where we started from, 5 credits, 5 passes, and now RSA and teacher's grade 3 certificate. If you are trying to create an officer class in a professional army, but you're working with material that really doesn't have the capacity to kind of take on the training and discharge those functions, then it's hardly a surprise that we ended up with some of the officers we ended up with. I mean, I'll give you one very, very obvious example. B.S. Dimka, who killed Murtala Muhammad, was one of the beneficiaries of that. This was somebody who was educationally incapable, had a major alcohol problem on top of it. And that's why he ended up, if you stop and think about it, why did he end up in the physical training corps and not in the fighting arms like it? Because he just couldn't manage it.
I want to talk about the quality, the uplift of quality, because there was a cadre of graduate officers, people like Ifajuna, people like, let's go back to Ojukwu, Banjo gained his BSc, I think, subsequently.
Correct.
Yes. Now, but there was a very strong intellectual character to a lot of the officers who were in position, in posts by 1964.
Mm.
Now, if we look at the fact that you reference the phantom coup, some call it, of 1964, the rumored coup, or should I say the phantom coup plot of 1964, which seemed to have some of these more intellectually endowed officers as suspected figures behind. Could you speak to this now, both from the perspective of the intellectual character, which then probably goes counter to what we talked about, the character of the officers who were, Dinka and the rest of them who were in place perpetrating certain acts all the way up to the 1970s. But one, was there actually a 1964 plot? And two, how would you comment on the character of those who were alleged to have been behind it?
Sure. I think that just to clarify one thing first, a lot of people mistakenly refer to Victor Banjo as the first graduate to be commissioned in the army. That's not true. He was commissioned and became a graduate afterwards by attending the Royal Military College of Science. The second is that actually the two graduates who were commissioned before independence were Ojukwu and Olutoi. Rotimi and Ifeadrina were both commissioned in 1961 and then Ademuga in 62. Now, those are a sum total of 5 officers, 6 max, in an officer corps that had 250. So they were a microscopic minority. That's the first point. The second point is that, and this is kind of referring to the 1964 thing, this came up, this was first brought up during the war by Gowon. That's the first time, that's the first recorded evidence that I have been able to find that this thing was first kind of raised as an issue. Now, don't forget that by that point, at the time he brought that up, and the story in essence was that Gowon said he had been approached by Ojukwu and Banjo, that the 3 of them, one from the north, one from the west, and one from the east, should, in the context of that chaotic federal election of 1964, where there was a standoff between Zik as the president and Balewa as the prime minister, and Zik refused to kind of commission Balewa to appoint a new government, and there was kind of drift and chaos for a few days. So Gowon's argument was that Banjo and Ojukwu had approached him and said that the 3 of them as a triumvirate should take over the government, sort this thing out, and then let them get on with it. The problem with that is that this was occurring at a time when Gowon and Ojukwu had fallen out spectacularly and were opposing sides in a war.
Yeah.
Secondly, by that time, Ojukwu had executed the 3rd, who was Banjo. So, in essence, because I couldn't find it, maybe out there somewhere, and I'd be very happy if somebody could point me in the direction of it, but independent corroborating evidence. My view is that I take that with a pinch of salt.
But then, 2 years after, there was definitely a coup attempt.
Absolutely.
Yes. And then that now raises the flag of my next question. What I'm going to ask them, because you talk about the motivations for the targets of 1966 coup. Could you, I find it fascinating. I mean, I have read some of these before, and you obviously reference quite credible works of military history or history in this regard. But could you go into a bit more detail as to one, was it that question, the Igbo, was it an Igbo coup? 1, and 2, what was the motivation behind those targeted for assassination and those actually assassinated in that coup?
Well, I have never been persuaded by the argument that it was an Igbo coup, because that, I think, is an intellectually lazy approach. Just because something appears to be something on the surface, taking it at face value without interrogating it a bit more deeply, I think is not a sensible way to proceed, certainly not the way in which I want to proceed. Now, yes, starting point is that, a coup particularly, and don't forget that, if we discount, as I think we must, the 64 thing we've just talked about, this really was the first proper coup. Okay? So there was no body of institutional knowledge to draw upon by these guys who did this first coup in completely different to what happened in subsequent years. Largely because actually it was the same people doing the same thing at different ranks. But so no experience, no institutional knowledge of this. Second is that this is an overtly illegal act. It is not something you would advertise. It is also not something you would take other people you did not feel that you could rely on into confidence. So by definition, you would be seeking out people who you know, or at least hope, are on the same page with you in terms of your thinking, and would be sufficiently bought into it not to kind of shop you to the authorities. In the Nigeria of the 1960s, if you look at the people, and again, you see, this is another very common misconception that this was Nzogu's school. Nzogu actually came into it much later on. The three people who planned that thing were Ifeanyi, Donatus Okafor, and Ogbuoji. All three Igbos, yes. But interrogate a little bit more deeply. Ifeanyi was a graduate. The other two, Donatus Okafor was commissioned from the ranks, and Ogbuoji went to Mons. Okay. Then look at the pattern of the people they subsequently recruited. So Ifeanyi, who was a brigade major in 2 Brigade in Apapa, then looked at his contemporaries who were around him. So people like Anufuru in Lagos, Humphrey Chukwuka, he recruited that lot. Then in Kaduna, Nzogu brought in the likes of Onwatuegu and Ben Bule, and then a few other kind of younger officers. Though many of them were Igbo speaking, and I think that's an important distinction actually, because there are people who are Igbo speaking who are not necessarily from the East, as you well know. Made it appear on the surface of it that this was an Igbo-dominated plot. If that is the case, then I ask people two things. Why is it that the most senior Igbo officer in the army at the time, Akintunde, was number one on the list of those to be eliminated? And in fact, actually played the biggest role of anybody else in suppressing that coup, particularly in Lagos on that night. I have spoken to a number of the people who were involved in that coup, and one of them told me that with hindsight, the mistake they made was delegating one Umuahia man, Ogbuoji, to kill another one, Irons. That with hindsight, they should have put somebody else on that particular case. But I have no doubt in my mind from the historical record, and looking at the special branch interrogations, Ironsi was the number one target of that coup in military terms. Which brings me to the next part of your question, which is, why were those people targeted? Well, it's very simple. They were the people who had their hands on the levers of power and who were best placed to frustrate the plotters' efforts. So in order to ensure two things, A, preferably the success of the coup, or B, that even if they did not entirely succeed, the government they were fighting to remove would not return to power, at least not in the same way as before. Look at the people they removed. The ultimate power broker was the federal prime minister. Okay, he had he was the biggest guy. The next biggest guy was Akinwunmi, because they headed the civilian and the military arms. If those two were no longer in the equation, I don't see how that coup could have failed. The reason it failed was that they did not take out Ironsi first. Now, why did that fail? A number of reasons, one of which I advance in the book. At that point, the entirety of all the people who took part in that coup, including the other ranks, in Lagos and in Kaduna and Ibadan, max 150. You were trying to arrest or incapacitate a number of people. One of the ways, the most effective way of decapitating a government is to sever what we call the 3 C's: command, control, and communication. So if the head cannot talk to the arms, then nothing's going to happen. So you remove the head, you break the communication link, the arms are useless. So what they did, what they were trying to do was that from the get-go, they were overstretched. They had too many things to do with too few people. So, for example, think about it. The guy who executed the coup in Ibadan, Nwobos, was actually in Abeokuta. He had to drive from Abeokuta to Ibadan that night. They had nobody in Ibadan to do the coup on the ground in Ibadan. So there were a whole variety of reasons. The people that were taken out, they took out the 2 brigade commanders, Maimalari in Lagos and Ademule in Kaduna. They took out one of the battalion commanders, Abogola Gema, who commanded the battalion in Ibadan, but who happened to be in Lagos that night. They removed the adjutant general. They removed the quartermaster general. So, in essence, they decapitated the army, with the exception of the big fish. If they had got Ironsi, it would have been a clean sweep of the army. I personally don't see why they shot Okotiero. He had nothing to do with any of this. I can understand why they might have kind of taken a dim view of Akintola, but again, he was not in the direct chain of command for anything. So if there would have been a better argument for saying that you kind of took out the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, that would make more military sense. The final thing I'd like to say on that is that one of the complaints is that, well, why didn't the coup take place in the East? And why didn't it take place in the Midwest? Well, Midwest can be very easily dealt with. There were no troops there. So let's just park that. The reason there was no coup activity in the East is that the conspirator who had been based in the East, who was supposed to actually lead the coup in the East, Julius Soka, was completely out of the blue, posted to India on a staff course. I think it was in December of 1965. So they hadn't actually had the time to kind of recruit a replacement for somebody to kind of organize the coups. And they sent one of the subalterns to drive from Lagos to go and execute the coup in Enugu. Of course, by the time they got there, the game was off in Lagos. And so nothing happened. I mean, they did kind of throw a cordon around the airport and arrested Okpara and then kind of sent all of them to their villages. But there was nobody in Enugu to coordinate the coup. Was it well planned and well thought through? No. Was it a sensible intervention? No. Did it benefit Nigeria at all? No. But was it an Igbo coup? I don't think so.
Okay. And my next question, I would probably add, was, but we cannot deny the fact that the preponderance, or there were more Igbo plotters. This is just a fact. You know what I mean? Okay. The next question I'll then ask is the intention to install Awolowo as the leader of a government post the coup. Do you find any credibility to that claim, to that suggestion?
I have there are two bits of evidence for that.
Yes.
One is that it is referred to in the interrogation of some of the suspects who were in detention in Kirikiri by the special branch. Second is that one of the people who actually directly took part in the coup in Kaduna, and who was in Kirikiri for a long time before they were all dispersed, actually confirmed to me that was in fact the intention. This individual was able to kind of provide detail about who was supposed to be flown by whom to go and spring Awolowo from Calabar and bring him back to Lagos. So there's that level of detail. If it is true, then you have to ask yourself, so how was this an Igbo coup then? The other thing to just perhaps mention is that I think what happened really is that there was a coup within a coup. I think Ironsi took advantage of what the Young Turks had done to seize power for himself, which begs the question, would Nigeria's political trajectory have been different if, as the departing British GOC had recommended, that Ogundipe and not Ironsi should have been his successor? And Ironsi was only appointed, in essence, as a compromise, because Balewa wanted Ironsi on the basis of seniority. Ironsi's case was being actively pushed by people like Keombadiwe and Azikiwe, the president. The Sardauna, who was in fact the de facto ruler of the country, his choice was Ademulewu, who was with him in Kaduna. And then the British GOC said, no, I think neither of these two. I think it should be and there's a copy of the top secret memo that he wrote to the Minister of Defense as an appendix in the book. So this went forth backwards and forwards for several days. Eventually, the Prime Minister sent Maitama Suli up to Kaduna to go and argue Ironsi's case directly with the Sardauna himself. And the Sardauna resisted for 2 or 3 days, absolutely flatly said, no, this has to be Ademulewu, who is my man. Eventually, he was persuaded to agree to Ironsi's appointment. And you wonder whether if it had been anybody other than Ironsi who was GOC that night, whether the army would have taken over. I have no way of knowing.
I think we've done 100 other questions, but then we don't have 100 other minutes to cover them. But it's been an education. I get no commission for saying this. I actually paid for this copy because I thought I should not get this book free. It's worthy of of more than one purchase. But anyway, it's been special. Thank you very much, Gerald, for this.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. When it seems like I'm nowhere to be found, if you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
Don't ruin your special moment. Shop now. Altmont.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.
We don't just think of ourselves as a bank. We think of ourselves as corporate citizens with responsibility for growing the economy. Reading and education is a key part of it. But equally important is having access to reading materials at home. A lot of the intervention we've done throughout this COVID is to ensure that people can safely navigate the uncertainties of the COVID crisis and come out of it ready for, to live again.
Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon.
The dreams that we have are limited by what we have directly interacted with. What reading does is it makes it possible for you to begin to live in worlds that don't yet exist. One read creates a discipline of reading. One read puts me on a timeline. It gives me an important book and I have an opportunity to read it and to collaborate. It's almost like having someone who does your book selection for you. If you have editors and people who are really good at this saying to you, this is the book for the month, I value that. I want to be able to read in a community. I want reading to be a collaborative thing. I want reading to be a communing, and One Read allows me to do that. I will use One Read any day, anytime.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.
Sticky, spicy, sweet.
Don't touch me! I will get you arrested! Very, very easy. Relax, everybody!
He shot you!